So for our thesis, we based our prediction for 2050 on economics. We think that the East will surpass the West economically by the end of the century. So our thesis is that the East is growing at an exponential rate. However, the United States is still doing very well in the global economy, and the East will suffer very soon from a humanitarian crisis. And due to the emphasis on individual freedom, a default to China will not end the West as we know it. And now Garrett is going to discuss the East's booming economy.
So the growth of the Eastern economy is not a zero-sum game. The zero-sum game is the idea that somebody else's gain is your loss. So what we're trying to say here is that even though the East is gaining ground on us, we're not actually losing. We're just growing at a smaller rate or a lower rate. We, as the West, can make gains and economic gains by investing in Eastern growth. The Western decline should not be thought of economically as a reduction in economic output or capacity. Many Western economies are growing. I'm going to show you a video here shortly that shows certain European economies that are slowing down slightly, but for the most part, most Western economies are still growing. And this rate of growth looks to carry well into the middle of the century as we know it. Something to take note of is that with this video that I'm about to show you and with many other models, economic models, they don't usually take into account all factors that can happen. For example, war, depression, recession, economic trend, shifting economic trends. These are very, can happen at any moment and are very hard to take into account when looking at a forecast. And so we're just going to show you this video here.
The global economy is expected to grow by 3% annually over the next half-century. But growth will be much stronger and much faster in emerging economies than in the developed countries of the OECD. The United States is the world's biggest economy today, representing 23% of global economic activity. GDP will shrink to 18% by 2030 and just 17% in 2060. China, which produces about 17% of global GDP today, is expected to pass the US to become the world's biggest economy. It will produce 28% of global GDP in 2030 and should stay at that level through 2060. China's growth and that of other fast-developing emerging countries will be driven by a better educated and more productive workforce. India will also benefit from population growth. It will jump from 7% of global GDP today to 11% in 2030 and 18% in 2060. Population aging, on the other hand, will drag down growth in many countries and regions. The euro area is the world's second leading economy, with 17% of global GDP. As the number of active Europeans declines, Europe's share of the world economy will drop to 12% by 2030 and just 9% by 2060. Japan, which accounts for 7% of global GDP today, faces a similar crisis. Its aging population will push its share of global GDP down to 4% by 2030 and just 3% by 2060. Today, the 34-country OECD represents 65% of global GDP. This will drop to just 43% in 2060, smaller than China and India, and well below the combined GDP of emerging economies. Incomes and living standards in emerging economies will converge with those in the OECD. Today, per capita GDP in countries like China India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey is just a fraction of that in the United States. After 50 years of rapid growth and shifting wealth, the emerging countries have drastically reduced the income gap with the United States. Richer OECD countries like France, Italy, Spain, Ireland, Greece will see their per capita income fall when compared with the US. None of these OECD projections are set in stone. Improving public finances and implementing bold structural reforms can boost long-term growth and living standards in advanced and emerging economies alike.
I think one thing the OECD did, or I suppose failed to do, was actually explain what OECD is. OECD is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. It's most of westernized countries are a part of it. European Union, Canada, the United States, Mexico, and Chile is the only one in South America. But anyhow, so something that video did touch on was the aging population with new modern medicine. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I said a little backwards this way, but GDP is it's a measure of how well a country's doing economically, how their it's the monetary measure of their economic value, so what their economic product is at the end of the year. China is the lowest among developed countries as of October, and their growth is actually slowing this year. They went from 8% to 6%, which doesn't sound like a very large number, but with economic trends, it's kind of a big deal for them. The things that can be attributed to it are 3.5 decades of the one-child policy. One-child policy forced all Chinese families to only have one child. But it'll cause irreparable damage because they will not have enough people to support their aging population. So because their older population is getting older, they're relying on the workforce, which is 18 to 65. There's not enough of them to support the children or to support the older people. They tried to make it with a two-child policy. This year, they just the two-child policy to try to fix that. On the other side of that, overpopulation, even though that's what they were trying to do, overpopulation has made that demographic shift that I was talking about with the aging population living longer and with overpopulation. But in 2005, the Amity Foundation in Nanjing, China was formed, and they attempted to rectify the situation, but the children, homelessness in children number in the millions, and they're having a lot of trouble trying to rein it all in, but they're having a real hard time keeping up.
Okay. Well, the point that I wanted to talk about was how individualism is like the key strength for the West. So up to this point, we've learned that the game is not us or them. It's not a zero-sum game, and no one's perfect, especially China. So what does that mean for us over the next 50 years and the problems that we're going to face? Well, we can look to history. What's that? So, yeah, after the Civil War, not only did we broaden human rights significantly, but we expanded the western frontier and we rebuilt the South. During World War II, domestic production increased during a depression. So why do we think that is? It's because there is opportunity in the struggle. Now, if individuals are free to earn money, they're more likely to fight for a cause or organize for good things. And in other words, when the tough get going, or when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Now, 57% of current Fortune 500 companies started during economic hard struggles. Now, they formed often because of the struggles that they were in, and like Walt Disney wanted to create good entertainment, so he created that during the Great Depression, and so many companies started because people couldn't get a job and they couldn't find other ways to make ends meet, so they started a business, and they make ends meet and they solve problems on the individual level, and that the struggle is a very real thing. Next one. So this is a trend we see all across the West. However, of course, the U.S. is a huge deal. The world looks to us for leadership. So that includes Europe, that includes China specifically. But remember, China just wants to be rich like us. So that brings us to the question of who exactly needs whom. Does China need us, or do we need China? Now, if you take a look at the charts here, clearly we owe trillions of dollars to China, but that's not even a drop in the bucket compared to how much debt the rest of the world owes to the United States, and then that's 34% of the total U.S. debt that we have. And so really America's value is the relative peace and freedom that we have on our continent. So of course our major trade partners are Canada and Mexico, and that's a significant deal because we have a whole continent of people just living in peace, living in harmony, and individuals are allowed to chase what they're after. And so I guess I think that our way of life here in the West is special and really shouldn't be taken for granted, and I think that we're going to be all right when it comes to China over the next few years. So, conclusion?
So we have discussed how the East will either westernize or suffer extreme depression based on humanitarian crisis and dewinding workforce. By talking about the growth of the Eastern economy and how it's not a zero-sum game, the humanitarian crisis of the East will strangle their booming economy, and due to the West's emphasis on individual freedoms and how it might lead to the default of China, which can be seen as not being the end of the West as we know it.
Very good.